to CNU Talks, Beyond the Great Lawn. CNU Talks is a virtual learning program created by and for the CNU community. Many of your beloved faculty and fellow captains will share topics which elicit thought and compassion, stimulate intellect, and connect us in profound ways. Today, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Jonathan White, Associate Professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University. Dr. White has published 10 books about the American Civil War and is one of the nation's foremost experts on the life and leadership of Abraham Lincoln. Just last year, Dr. White proudly published Untouched by the Conflict with one of his CNU students, Daniel Glenn. Dr. White is a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians and serves on several boards, including the Abraham Lincoln Institute and the Lincoln Forum. Dr. White is a past recipient of the CNU Alumni Society Award in recognition of his excellence as a teacher scholar. And in 2019, Dr. White was the recipient of the Outstanding Faculty Award from SCHEV, the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia. This coveted and prestigious award is recognized as one of the highest achievements in academia. We hope that today you will enjoy, as much as we do, CNU Talks.
This semester at CNU, I've been teaching one of my favorite courses, American Studies 330, Treason in America. I love teaching this course. We look at the fascinating stories of American scoundrels from the colonial era to the present. Tomorrow, we'll be examining World War II, dealing with the Nazi saboteurs and Japanese internment. When I teach a class like this, I try to get my students to realize that the people we're studying are real people. It's easy for us to lose sight of that fact. When you read documents, when you look at words on a page, you lose sight of the fact that the people we study in American history, or any period of history, were living, breathing human beings who experienced life in ways that are sometimes not so different from the way we do. Every fall, I teach a super section at CNU. That's a class with 99 students. It's very unusual at CNU, but I love teaching the course because I find it exciting to have so many students in one classroom who I get to engage with about important ideas and important people from American history. On the first day of that class, I always walk in. It's a large lecture hall. No one knows me, or very few of them know me. I know very few of them on the first day of class. I don't introduce myself. I plug in my PowerPoint, I pull up a screen. I tell the students to put their laptops away and their phones because I don't allow technology in my classroom. And without any sort of introduction, I start telling a story. I put up a slide of Abraham Lincoln's cabin, the cabin that he was thought to have been born in. It actually turns out it wasn't the cabin he was born in. But I start telling a story of Abraham Lincoln born on a cold winter day in February 1809 in the middle of nowhere in Kentucky. And I trace the story through his life. I look at his early childhood, his life with his parents and his sister. I look at his family moving to Indiana and then to Illinois. I talk about the ways that he made money when he was a young guy. I talk about his experience going to school. I show the students some of the handwritten notes that he made when he was about 15 years old, figuring out different kinds of complex math problems. I talk about his love life, the young woman named Anne Rutledge, who he fell in love with in Illinois when he was a young man, and the despair that he experienced when she died at a very young age in 1835. I talk about some of his rebounds. College students can understand what that's like. You're in a long-term relationship or a serious relationship, and it falls apart, and maybe you have some rebounds, and Abraham Lincoln had some rebounds of his own. I even tell a crazy story that it may or may not be true, we'll never know for sure, where during one of these periods, Lincoln allegedly visited a prostitute and didn't have enough money to pay her, so he gave her the little bit of money he had and left. And she said, "Mr. Lincoln, you're the most conscientious man I've ever met." I tell about the way he taught himself law and became a lawyer. I tell about how he was a great wrestler. I talk about how he served in in a war, in the Black Hawk War, although he had more bloodshed from mosquitoes than from anything else. And I eventually then bring them up to the point where he meets Mary Todd right before he marries her. And I give them a little bit of a hint of the rocky nature of their relationship and how it even involved getting involved in a duel. And I stop after about 45 minutes of this, and I look at the class, and I say, you all are probably really confused right now. You came in on the first day of class, you expected me to go over the syllabus, to tell you what you'd be reading, what you'd be required to do to pass this class. And instead, for some reason, you've now just heard a 45-minute lecture on the early life of Abraham Lincoln. And I can look out at the crowd, look out at my students, and see that most of them are a little perplexed by this. This is not a typical first day of class. And I then put up a picture of the Lincoln Memorial. And I say to them, when most of us think about Abraham Lincoln, if we think about him at all, we think about this. We think about a statue in a temple. It's larger than life. We think about the way that when we go to that, when we approach that temple, we stand in reverence, in awe. We're supposed to stand in silence. Maybe we take a picture, a selfie, marking that moment that we're there, standing at the feet of the great man. And we forget that Abraham Lincoln was a real person. We forget that he suffered from emotional breakdowns, possibly clinical depression, some people think. We forget that he had difficulties in his relationships. We forget that he rose from poverty. We forget that he experienced love and loss. We forget that he was a real human being. And I say to my students, next class, we're going to be reading a speech that Lincoln wrote in 1838. And I've brought you up to this period in his life, right where he was delivering this speech. And if we just read the speech without knowing anything about him at this point in his life, it's a political speech, and it's a really interesting one and a good one, and it gives us a lot to talk about. But we forget that he was a 29-year-old guy who was experiencing life on the frontier, and that he was going through some hard times around the period that he delivered this speech. And my hope in doing this on the first day of class in American Studies 100 is that my students will have the American story come alive to them in a way that maybe they haven't experienced before. That it'll open their eyes and their minds to the reality of the lived experience of at least one person in this case, who they know something about, but who they've maybe not thought about on a deeper level. And throughout the semester, we spend a lot of time studying Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton. We read all sorts of great American thinkers, Susan B. Anthony, and others. And I tell the students, and I reiterate this and reinforce it throughout the semester, I want you to think about these people as real people. Not just words on a page, not just distant figures who lived a long time ago, but engage with them, engage with their ideas. And hopefully throughout the semester, those people who are so distant maybe become a little more alive in the minds of my students. It's always a joy for me to get to teach these classes. American Studies 100 is a wonderful class to teach because we look at these really important ideas in the American experiment. We look at the founding. What is it that the founders hope to do in the Declaration of Independence? What is it that they hope to do in the Constitution? How were the ideals of 1776 and 1787? How were those ideals then carried forward through different generations of Americans, whether it's women pushing for suffrage at Seneca Falls in 1848, or abolitionists pushing for the end of slavery, or civil rights activists in the 1950s and 60s. It's a real joy for me to dig into those ideas with students, most of whom are not American Studies majors. In fact, I imagine that a lot of my students in that class, out of 99 students, have never heard of American Studies before that first day of class when they come to CNU and they get put into my course. But my hope is that by the end of the semester, they'll have a really great appreciation for the things that we talk about. My treason class is a great deal of fun because in that case, we're looking at just wild and fantastic stories of traitors and scoundrels and military officers and all sorts of different people who get involved in the stories of treason and disloyalty. I first came up with the idea to teach my treason class my first year when I was here at CNU. I got here in the fall of 2009, and that first semester I was here, I taught American Studies 100. And in the spring, I created my course on treason. And at the very same time that I was creating that course, I was writing a book about treason. And I had found a document that a traitor from the Civil War had written, a letter where he explained what he was doing when he committed treason or when he was arrested for having committed treason. And so that semester, the spring of 2010, I was working on a book that I wound up publishing about a year later called Abraham Lincoln and Treason in the Civil War, The Trials of John Merryman. And John Merryman was this really interesting character from Baltimore County, Maryland. And he burned railroad bridges at the beginning of the Civil War around Baltimore. And his goal was to try to stop Union soldiers from getting to Washington, D.C. to defend the national capital. And so he got arrested for treason and thrown in Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor and held there for about 6 weeks before he was released and then indicted for treason. And a lot of people have come across his story before, and his case actually even sometimes gets taught in law schools around the country. But I found this letter that he wrote in 1863 describing why he did what he had done, and no one had ever seen it before, not for 150 years. And so that semester, as I was creating this course on treason, I also then was writing about it. And it was just this wonderful experience to be thinking so deeply about a subject where I was writing about it and researching it and then going into the classroom and teaching with it. And I would come up with ideas as I was writing and as I was researching that I would then go into class. And I would experiment and I would put these ideas forward and let my students engage with me and help me think through the book. And I actually thanked my students in the book for helping me think through the ideas that eventually wound their way into the book itself. And as I was doing that, it was tremendously gratifying to be able to work closely with CNU students and to engage them in my own research. And over time, I started to have an idea, it's really important for people to be able to communicate clearly and well, both orally and in writing. And if students can demonstrate on their resumes or their CVs that they can communicate clearly and well in writing, it can be very helpful for landing a good job. And around 2012 or 2014, I had the idea to start having students do projects, small written projects, that they would take a historical subject or some sort of aspect of American studies and write a short article about it. And I would work with them draft after draft after draft and teach them the process of research and writing and then revision. We often forget that revising one's work is the most important aspect of writing. And through that process, I was then able to work with my students to be able to publish pieces of their own. And over the last 5 or 7 years, I've helped my students publish more than 24 articles. A lot of these have been in magazines that are geared towards popular history audiences. Some of them have been in bulletins of local museums like the Hampton Roads Naval Museum. One of the articles I co-authored with 2 students. We published in the Federal Lawyer, which is the magazine of the of the Federal Bar Association. A few of my students have published articles in peer-reviewed journals, which has been a really incredible thing. And a couple months ago, late 2019, I was actually able to publish a book with a student. When I was an undergrad at Penn State, more than 20 years ago, I worked as a volunteer intern at a historic site outside of Philadelphia where I grew up. The site is called Pennypacker Mills, and it's a home of an earlier governor of Pennsylvania. And one of my projects at Pennypacker Mills was to catalog the letters that later Governor Pennypacker received during the course of his lifetime. And as I was going through his letters, I found that he received about 400 letters from a guy named Singleton Ashenfelter. And Singleton Ashenfelter was a really interesting character who had a very big personality. And in 1862, Singleton Ashenfelter went to Dickinson College, and he started writing letters to his best friend back home, Samuel W. Pennypacker. And those letters began first semester at college and then extended until Ashenfelter died in the early 20th century. For 40 years, these two guys wrote back and forth, and Pennypacker kept all of his correspondence. And so there were about 40 letters from the Civil War years, 1862 to 1865, that documented this one college student's experience in college during the Civil War. And one of the most remarkable aspects of the letters is that the war had very little impact on Ashenfelter's life. He was so consumed with what was going on in his mind and in his heart that he was almost living in a world away from the hundreds of thousands of young men dying during the Civil War. And 20 years ago, I found these letters, and I took notes on them, and I photocopied all the Civil War letters, and I sort of tucked them away in a folder and didn't do much with them over the last 2 decades. And a couple of years ago, I had a very talented first-year student named Daniel Glenn, and I asked Daniel to be my summer scholar at CNU, which meant that he worked as a research assistant for me, and he and I then worked on some projects together. And during the summer, I said to him, I found these letters about 20 years ago, and I think that they could be publishable. They're really interesting. They're not known at all. And I said, if you're willing to take a risk with me, I'd be willing to try to have us publish these as a book. And so Daniel did the first pass transcribing them, and it came out to 200 pages, I think, of a Word document. And then he and I sat down together and read through them and checked the transcription and made corrections. And then we did all the annotation coming up with the footnotes. And then we wrote an introduction together. And we sent the whole book out for peer review, and we sent it to Kent State University Press. And Kent State was thrilled to publish. And so this came out in September of 2019, and it's called Untouched by the Conflict, because it tells the story of this college student who went through the war as if there was not a war actually happening, so close to where he was in college. It was a really great thrill for me to be able to work with Daniel on this project. And so now I've done a number of articles with students, and I've done this book with Daniel. And the book has already started to get very positive reviews in historical journals, which has been a great thrill for both Daniel and me. This is the sort of thing that I love doing with students, whether it's in the classroom or research and writing or editing a book like this. When Daniel and I were doing this project, we were immersing ourselves into the world of a college student who lived 150 years ago. And it was so interesting as Daniel and I would have conversations as we were doing this work, because he would say, the questions that Ashenfelter is asking are the same questions I'm thinking about. The emotions or the different things that he's going through are the same things that I'm going through 150 years later as a college student. And that is the joy for me of teaching, and the joy for me of research, and the joy for me of writing, is bringing things that are really important from the American experiment, from all different time periods, and bringing them into the present and helping them become real to those around me, my students or my readers or people who see C-SPAN films that I do, getting the past to be relevant and interesting.